To hear this and many more audiobooks not available on YouTube in a podcast feed, please visit the first link in the description below, and thank you for your support. America Against America by Wang Huning. Chapter 11. Undercurrents of Crisis. Section 1. Family Concept. The American concept of family or family organization, most of those who have not been educated in Eastern culture do not agree and do not appreciate. The American concept of family is very different from what it was decades ago. Of course, there are millions of American families and they vary. What we analyze is only the typical and representative mainstream American family concept. It is important to have a union of a man and a woman to form a family. For most American men and women, this union does not interfere with the privacy of each of them. Many couples treat each other with respect and do not interfere with each other's privacy. This pattern of relationship between them is not acceptable in China or Japan. Men and women are consultative on many issues, and it sounds like two people who don't know each other very well are talking about one thing. Of course, there exist harmonious families. The development of American conjugal life to this point is the result of a society that has long pursued individualism. Americans have been trained in this way since childhood, and regard this value as more important than any other value. On the other hand, as a result of this long-term education, they have become less adept at dealing with people and no longer live with them. I personally believe that this is a problem for the future of American society. Marriage does not break the fortress that is built in everyone's heart, especially young couples. Older couples seem to need to rely on each other more and to pay less attention to maintaining the inner barrier. How is this barrier formed? It starts with the environment in which Americans are raised. I think many young couples are too individualistic and selfish to pay much attention to the support and education of their children, not like the Orientals, who expect their children to grow up, and not like the traditional Westerners, who devote their hearts and souls to them. Very young children, not even a year old, are usually sent to a separate room. The American concept is that this allows the child to learn to have a private domain. To learn to have their own domain, on the other hand, can also protect the private domain of the parents. This is the beginning of children learning to be independent. Independence and individualism are highly valued by Americans. Parents instill this in their children and at the same time protect themselves. They do not want to lose this to themselves as a result of the birth of a child. Their innermost, perhaps unconscious motivations push them to encourage their children to go first and stand on their own 2 feet. In terms of social effects, this may have positive implications. Children are taught early on that they should make their own decisions and be responsible for their own actions. This allows parents to get rid of their children earlier. Children start earning money at an early age, and parents give them some money. Many very young children have bank accounts. Children between the ages of 9 and 10 can deliver newspapers to their neighbors, and children between the ages of 13 and 18 can babysit for their neighbors. American society is a money society, and parents know that in order for their children to gain independence, they must force them to learn to deal with money. At the age of 18 to 21, parents encourage their children to leave home and lead an independent life. Generally, children go out to earn their own living at this age. The relationship between children and their families after they go out is, from the Chinese perspective, very weak. You often hear stories about children calling their parents and telling them what time they will come and go on a certain day, and then they will leave. Young people entering society is like entering a battlefield. They can't help but make a good living. This pressure also forces them to be incapable of taking care of their parents. I know people who love their parents, but they don't have time to visit them often. I also know many people who are indifferent to the elderly. Many elderly people are living in nursing homes or whatever, and their children amount to no role. Regardless of the reason, it is extremely difficult for the giving daughter to support the elderly. What does the current situation of the elderly teach the young? What imprint will it leave on the young? Parents usually don't care about their children's marriage either. It's up to them. Children just bring their girlfriends or boyfriends home to meet with their parents. Americans are more casual in this regard, while the rich and famous may be more strict. Parents are also the same people. Young people usually have boyfriends or girlfriends in high school, and the concept of sex is more open, and parents have no objection to the opposite sex friends of their children at the age of 15 or 16. One teacher I knew brought her son and her son's girlfriend into the classroom and introduced them to everyone. Her son was 15 years old. I asked her what she thought about this relationship. She said she thought it was great, and that her son's girlfriend was 2 years older than him, had her own car, and wouldn't let her son drink or smoke. Accepting this fact is commonplace in America because that's how parents come by it. The concept of girlfriends and boyfriends in no way implies marriage, which of course is possible. Attitudes toward children arise for a variety of reasons, and I actually think many people love their children very much. However, the average family must let their children become independent early and cannot afford to provide for them, so they are unable to love. In turn, children love their parents, but parents cannot depend on their children for their old age, and children cannot afford it, so children cannot love either. This relationship has far-reaching consequences for society. Parents have to rely on the social security or welfare system in their old age, but not on their children. The elderly must build a life of their own. Chinese culture contains a strong element of raising children for old age, and filial piety is one of the basic concepts of Chinese culture. It is not that Americans do not want to have this concept, but they are unable to have it. One friend said that in addition to cultural factors, material conditions are also important. Raising children for old age is a product of agricultural civilization and is bound to diminish under the impact of industrial civilization. The present of the elderly is the future of the young. This situation of the elderly influences the attitude of young parents towards the upbringing of their children. From the time they start to have children, they know in their hearts that the child cannot be relied upon in the future, that raising him is a unilateral obligation, and that in most cases they cannot expect anything in return. What kind of effect does this have on parents? It is no small challenge for parents to truly take on the responsibility of raising their children, i.e., to overcome their own individualism, not in a derogatory sense, but in reference to a cultural phenomenon which has been passed on from generation to generation, and it is extremely difficult to choose a new beginning, which is a problem for the future. Aristotle said more than 2,000 years ago that the family is the cell of society. In the years since the war, the family has disintegrated in the United States. On the surface, the family is still the cell of society, but in reality, the real cell of society in the United States is the individual. Family organization and the concept of the family are accelerating this process of disintegration. The overly traditional family is too tightly bound to the individual and is not conducive to his or her development. But is an excessively loose family conducive to social progress? The family could have reconciled a number of interpersonal conflicts and relationships. After the family is divided, these conflicts will have to be left to society. The government bears a heavy burden due to family fragmentation, from children's education to elderly issues. This has become a major burden for economic and social development, but today, with the increasing fragmentation of family organization, this burden is likely to get bigger and bigger. All the government can provide is the material conditions. Who will regulate the emotional problems? The fragmentation of the family has deprived society of many human feelings, which is also detrimental to a harmonious society. Many people are also worried about the evolution of the family. One example of this is the neoconservative mindset. Neoconservatism emphasizes the role of the family, and many people want the family to pass on basic norms, such as religion, morality, and ethics. But it is not easy to do so with such mechanisms in American society. Whether society is better off with individuals as cells or with families as cells, and how families should be formed, have different ideas in different cultures. American society to this day still has the family as the basic unit of society, but in spirit the family is being hollowed out, while society has not yet developed a complete regulatory mechanism with the individual as the cell. Two final questions to ask. Is human nature adapted to living a life with or without family emotions? Is individualism an emotional choice or something that has to be accepted? Does socioeconomic development inevitably lead to the breakdown of the traditional family, as seems to be the path taken by American society? The dilemma is between modernization and traditional social structure. I was deeply impressed by the difficulty of this issue when I was in Singapore. Singapore is a Chinese society and a newly industrialized country. The primary problem encountered after economic development was the danger of family disintegration. Singapore sought to cushion the shockwaves of modernization through Confucianism. The evolution of the concept of family and family organization is also a good reflection of Marcuse's depiction of the one-sided man. Marcuse's question for America is, can a civilization of love and lust replace a civilization of technology? My question is, what kind of emotions should human society maintain in addition to sexuality? Section 2. The Ignorant Generation. The education crisis of the young generation has become a worrying social issue. University education is of a considerable standard. The main reason is also that there is a wide range of universities available to young people, and talents are weeded out in universities, not before. But secondary education is a concern, and the standard of secondary high school education is surprisingly poor. A special program, Burning Questions, was broadcast on TV on October 4th entitled, Why Are Kids Failing? It was shocking to watch. In one of the few developed countries like the United States, the standard of education is so poor that it is inconceivable to the average person. The television program was divided into 3 segments: high school students, teachers, and parents. The basic knowledge of high school students was very narrow, and the TV reported the results of some tests. In terms of knowledge about their own country, 81% knew that the U.S. military's participation in World War II began with Pearl Harbor. Only 64% knew that the government is divided into legislative, judicial, and executive branches, and that there are checks and balances among them, and only 42% knew about the Monroe Doctrine. Only 20% knew that the Supreme Court ruled that segregation of blacks and whites was unconstitutional. In terms of world knowledge, high school students have even more problems. Most don't know about international political leaders, but are familiar with popular singers like Jackson and Madonna, and only 25% know about Orwell's book, 1984. Americans see this as a serious problem, and of course there is an ideological element to it. In mathematics, too, it is amazing that only 60% of people know what 87% of 10 is. In geography, too, it is a record that 50% of the people cannot find out where Washington, D.C. is. I know an international student from Taiwan. He once said that an American student asked him where he was from, and he said Taiwan. But to his surprise, he asked a dumbfounding question: where in Europe is Taiwan? Another international student from Panama also told me that the American college students' concept of Panama is a canal with many houses on both sides, and they have no idea that Panama is a country. Such issues, which have been discussed in the United States for a long time, cannot be written or calculated for Americans, and Americans themselves are worried. A man once told me that a friend he knew had a store where you could buy 6 bottles of Coca-Cola at a discount, such as 50 cents a bottle, and 6 bottles would only cost $2. An American came to buy it, and he introduced him to buy 6 bottles for $2, but the man just couldn't do the math and said he would rather buy 1 bottle at a time. This is, of course, an extreme example. The October 3rd Chicago Tribune reported that IBM, which has an adult literacy center, is implementing a program to teach adults to read and write, and that IBM offers classes 3 days a week with students ranging from 20 to retirement age. IBM's purpose for this program is noteworthy. Dave Cox, manager of the IBM Adult Literacy Center, said, "We see adult illiteracy as a major economic problem. If we're going to expand our economy and compete, we need to get a workforce that's trained and able to get trained." Based on 1980 statistics, Illinois officials estimated that approximately 2 million people in the state could be considered virtually illiterate. This figure is estimated to be 750,000 for the city of Chicago. Across the United States, the magnitude of the problem is not hard to imagine. If the education system is not producing qualified people, the future development of the United States will be a very difficult problem, and one of the major reasons for Japan's post-war economic stress was the rigor of its education system. Today, Japan's education system is still quite effective, and I am afraid that this is the biggest challenge facing the United States. In addition to intellectual education, serious problems exist in the area of ethics and values. The situation of young people in this area is also worrying. The key factor is the loss of faith and ethics among the young generation. Conservatives are very disgusted by this. The summary of this TV show is that children lack values, discipline, and goals. What are the reasons? Teachers responded that teachers' salaries are too low and their treatment is too bad and that they can't keep people in high schools and that they all want to move. Parents respond that they are too busy working, don't have time to take care of their children, and can't make enough money. The question is this a problem that can be solved by increased federal funding? Partially, but not completely. The American mind is prone to think about grants. I was watching this TV program in a moderate-level family where the owner had a daughter who was a high school student and another daughter's classmate. After watching the TV show, we discussed the issue. The daughter said, "It's true that this phenomenon exists in the United States, but in my school the problem is not as serious, and the students do much better. The students' lack of knowledge of geography may be related to the fact that life is so privileged that they don't need to go to another country to get comfortable living conditions. Different people have different choices about values, disciplines, and goals." Her classmate said, "This problem is especially evident in big cities and poor areas where many people can't read or write, and they think that studying doesn't make immediate money, while dealing drugs or doing something else does. There is no immediate benefit to getting more education, and that's a big reason why." This high school student is one who has thought about this issue. In a commodity economy, the power of money is irresistible. Without a force to guide it, people will be profit-oriented. This will eventually lead to serious social problems. Many developing countries are also in such a predicament. To develop the economy, we need first to mobilize the monetary mechanism to guide people's energy. When the economy has developed the need for high technology, only to find it difficult to find such talent because the monetary power will tend to make people look for simple labor to earn money rather than complex labor. This is a lesson for developing countries to learn from. Problems that money can solve, wisdom must be able to solve. But what wisdom cannot solve, money must not solve. This owner's comment expresses more prominently the seriousness of the problem. Of course, this is an absolutist statement. The problem can only be solved by combining wisdom and money. The problem in developing countries is not primarily the amount of wisdom or currency in absolute terms, but how the two are combined. He said, "Youth have no values, discipline, and purpose, mainly because their parents have none either." This statement points out where the worries of the educated class lie. This generation was made by the past generation, and the next generation will be made by this one, and the end is conceivable. If the transmission of basic knowledge is problematic, how can the basic values and beliefs of society be transmitted? How can they be socialized? This is the greatest challenge not only to American society and economy, but also to American politics. The rise of neoconservatism suggests that this concern has reached considerable proportions. Section 3. Stray Teenagers. What has been the impact of the change in the concept of the family and the loosening of its organization in society, and has it contributed to social development or the opposite? This question deserves to be studied. The development of individualism has resulted in concerns about who will take family responsibilities seriously. A frequent problem for young couples is how to resolve family responsibilities. In small and medium-sized cities and families in the countryside, I think the concept of family is still relatively strong. Those with higher education are also clearer about family and responsibilities. Although the American social mechanism makes it clear that children are not dependent, responsible parents still do their part to raise their children to adulthood. However, the concept of individualism and private domain is so deeply rooted that it also hangs over family relationships. I think this family spirit, individualism and private domain, makes family relationships more difficult to adjust, and there is more tension in the family. It is difficult for parents to manage older children, even though the parents may be right. Parents sometimes have difficulty considering the wishes of their children because they have to maintain their own private sphere. Problems can arise between couples for the same reasons. The divorce rate in the United States is high, and many of the reasons for this are not social or other issues, but rather the spirituality of the individual. The Academy Award-winning film, Kramer vs. Kramer, profoundly reflects the problems posed by this spiritual condition. What is notable is not the stated reason for Joanna's departure, but the husband's attitude toward his children. This inner spirit in the family brings a lot of problems: high divorce rate, many single parents, many stray teenagers, etc. Let's look at the problem of stray teenagers. The concept of stray teenagers is a Singaporean concept, similar to the Chinese term escaping the night and the Beijing vernacular shabu shabu night. Family problems first affect the teenage generation, and family conflicts lead to teenage runaways, making it a major problem in society. The reason why I think this issue is important is that youth is the future of a society. If you lose a generation of youth, you lose the future. What is the future of society? The answer also lies in the growth of the young generation. Birch Bayh, chairman of the Senate Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, said in 1976, "Our youth are the nation's most valuable resource. Society can certainly produce a large number of elites, but a society needs elites as much as it needs masses. If the masses are the beat generation, how can society progress?" From the combination of family, we go to the stray juvenile, just to trace the function of family from the phenomenon of stray juvenile. At hand is the book written by Arnold P. Reuven, Juvenile Delinquency, the Stray Teenager in America. This book was published in 1976. Although it was published 12 years ago, it still has value. The number of juvenile delinquents in the United States was estimated at 1 million per year in 1975, which is a conservative figure. In 1973, police authorities caught 265,000 juvenile runaways. Runaways are children and teenagers who have run away from home without parental consent. The youngest children were around 10 years old. We can look at some of the causes and consequences of juvenile runaways described by Reuben. Terry: "The main reason I ran away was because there was too much tension at home." Terry, 17, says she didn't want to go back because there was too much tension at home, nor did she want to go to school where she couldn't learn anything useful. Randy, 17, from Florida: "My father put me on a bus and told me, 'Don't let me see you again.' He says he ran away because my parents wanted to get rid of the burden, and they thought there was something wrong with my head." He and his sister were adopted. Cassie, San Diego, who began straying at age 13, says she couldn't stay with her stepfather, who was an alcoholic. Her father beat her. "One day I came home an hour late and walked home with a friend, and he tried to beat my friend, and my mother stopped him. He hit me with a belt and asked me why I was late coming home, and came with a knife, and my mother stopped him." Rick, 12 years old. Rick's parents do not live together, and he has not seen his mother for 7 years. He lives with his father and grandparents, all 3 of whom are alcoholics. His father beat him up when he drank. Shirley, from a very comfortable family. "My mother had very bad health. The house was a mess, and she wanted people to notice her, sometimes beating me to achieve this. When she returned home after 2 runs, her father told her she couldn't live at home, and she ran away from home and lived on the street for about a month." Burkholder, 15, was killed in New York by what police said was her customer. She had been caught by the police for prostitution, but she convinced the police department that she was 19 years old and a first-time sex worker, and they let her go. She was killed the next night. White Clay, who was caught in prostitution after running away, was later murdered. The reason was that her father left home 10 years ago without telling her, and her family was trapped in poverty and could not help but rely on government funding. She wanted to get out of that situation. I have only casually given a few of the various examples mentioned by Reuben. As you can see, most cases are caused by family tension, whatever the cause of the tension. Of course, there are also some children who run away because their parents do not buy hi-fi equipment or other reasons, but the deeper reason lies in the inability of many families to achieve true inner harmony. How can there be true inner harmony when everyone wants to have individualism and private spheres? Individualism and private domains are important values in American society, but are they beneficial and harmless within any limits? Even the best things are bound to go the other way if they are allowed to proliferate without limits. In the United States, the work sector generally pays little attention to the private sphere of the individual. Should the same be true of families, or does it require some kind of reconciliation? Wandering teenagers reflect at at least a lack of attraction for families. This social problem also implies two problems of social development. For one thing, there is a tendency to weaken the social function of the family. The family is an important place to educate the young generation and to coordinate a part of the conflicts in society. Due to the evolution of family relations, a large number of youth problems are presented to the society. The government spends tens of millions of dollars every year for the matter of stray teenagers alone. Accordingly, the government has established organizations and facilities such as shelters for stray teenagers. This has actually increased the pressure on society, increased government spending, and increased interpersonal tensions. The second is whether adolescents, having grown up in this environment from a young age, can have the psychological structure needed for the healthy development of a society. The path that adolescents should take, while not compulsive, should not be left to chance. Such a large number of adolescents living in such an atmosphere has a poor prognosis for a society. In fact, a large number of stray teenagers are involved in crime or become the target of crime and lose their educational opportunities. The rapid development of Japanese society is closely related to the fact that Japan has a complete juvenile correctional mechanism. It may be that the Japanese approach is unacceptable from the viewpoint of Western culture, but the success of Japan shows that the opposite path can mean failure. Every society should find good mechanisms to reach this goal. Will future generations in the United States still be able to hold up the American shelf? Many Americans doubt it. The development of a society depends, of course, on political institutions, business, finance, science and technology, and culture, but also on the basic organization, the family. The question is how to reconcile the evolving social spirit with the family. This determines the magnitude of socio-political coordination. Section 4. Non-toxic United States. The concept of America in today's world must be associated with drugs, so it is called No Drugs, No America. Drugs have become an insurmountable problem in American society. The Reagan administration has recently launched a strong offensive against drug trafficking, but it is difficult to say how effective it will be. Criminal groups have organized themselves around the drug trade and are using every trick in the book to get around the government's anti-drug organizations. Drugs enter the United States through a variety of channels. In some cities, it is easy to get a pack of drugs, and they are peddled on the streets. Many people become addicted to drugs and end up getting caught up in them and can't get out. Some people are addicted to drugs and cannot help but be swayed by criminal syndicates, and young girls thus have to sell their bodies for drugs. Drugs are encroaching on the United States with a force that I fear exceeds the various forces that have impacted the country throughout history. The proliferation of drugs also poses a powerful challenge to the institutions of society. The ability to curb and curtail the proliferation of drugs is a test of social institutions and even of the moral spirit. The proliferation of drugs affects the physical and mental health of youth, first and foremost. Teenage drug use is exceptionally high. I saw a movie about how a high school principal goes about running a dirty school with a black high school student as his main opponent. He had a group of students embracing and openly dealing drugs in the school's restrooms. They set up a poisonous attack on this principal and demolished the principal's motorcycle. Finally, several men came with guns to kill the principal. When he was almost killed, the principal was accidentally saved and the student was arrested by the police. When the police car drove away, he stared at the principal with two dead eyes and a chilling look of resignation. There is naturally artistic processing in this, but I'm afraid it's not far from the actual process in some serious cases. The tentacles of drug organizations have long reached out to all corners of society, especially places where youth are concentrated. It may be better in small towns, but it is even worse in big cities. Let's look at an article in the May 1987 issue of Ladies' Home Journal, a magazine. The title is Children and Drugs. The author begins by quoting a letter from President Reagan to the magazine. Drugs threaten every American family and our own way of life. Drugs deprive young people of the education they need and prevent 10 out of every 1,000 Americans from working. Drugs are closely linked to crime, destroying property, raising insurance rates, straining police departments and law enforcement officers of all kinds, and causing us enormous damage. Our economic damage can be measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, but how do you measure the damage of a nation whose lives are ruined? These words are indicative of the serious challenges the United States has encountered. What is the state of drug use among youth? This magazine surveyed several young people. One of them responded as follows. Tim Osiecki. I started using drugs when I left elementary school and entered middle school. I found a lot of drugs in this school, maybe because I knew some of the older kids and the kids from the inner city. Some of the people I knew did drugs, and at first I wasn't interested. Then I started doing marijuana, and soon the stuff stopped working. Then I met kids from very rich families. They introduced me to expensive drugs, like cocaine. I used it, and since then, cocaine has been an inseparable part of my life. After a teenager gets into the habit of using drugs in society, school, or wherever, he or she cannot extricate himself or herself from the mire. There are many different kinds of drugs. Some are medical drugs, but overdose can be addictive and harmful to the body. The names of drugs are heroin, morphine, codeine, methadone, cocaine, barbiturates, amphetamines, LSD, DMT, mescaline, psilocybin, alcohol, etc. There are countless drug crimes committed by teenagers who have gone from drug use to crime. Numerous movies and television shows have been produced, and uncountable fictional stories have been written around this subject. One movie was about a couple of high school students who got their hands on a small box of drugs and wanted to sell them. After contacting another gang, they arranged to meet somewhere, but found that the other gang was armed with a deadly weapon and wanted to kill them, so they hastily drew their guns so that they would not be in danger. The other two students found out that they had a small box of drugs and tried to rob them. This day they brought a gun. Just in time to meet another gang also came to rob. A three-way battle ensued. 2 people died. One of the students was killed, and the other fled to run over the brother of the leader of the group of students who had the drugs and was himself put in a juvenile reformatory. The latter, desperate for revenge for the death of his brother, deliberately raped the former's girlfriend and ended up in a juvenile facility as well. The 2 of them fought in the juvenile reformatory. Finally, one night, the latter knocked out the guards and stormed into the former's room and engaged in a fight to the death, resulting in a bloody fight in which both were injured. They were both underage teenagers. Naturally, drug addiction is not limited to teenagers. There are plenty of drug addicts among adults to catch. The problem is that these people are addicted to drugs from their teenage years. Drug addiction can have serious consequences, mainly in the physical and mental aspects. It is entirely possible to make a person depressed, weak, anxious, and finally destroy a person's normal mental state, and sometimes even lead to death. There are also different views on drug abuse. Thomas S. Saz, for example, wrote an article arguing that most people are against drug abuse and believe that coercive policies are needed because drugs are too dangerous, but he argues that each person can damage and kill himself, which is a fundamental aspect of human freedom. Self-destruction can be seen as a sin and punished by informal means, but it cannot be seen as a crime or a mental illness that can be controlled by police force. Therefore, it is absurd to prevent an adult from possessing drugs. Weapons and sharp edges are more dangerous, but no one prohibits them. It is a right, so adults cannot be denied the right to possess and use drugs, even though most people don't use them. This is a classic contrarian notion. This idea is not the mainstream now. The mainstream is advocating for effective government action against drug trafficking and drug use. That said, it cannot be claimed that this argument is not valid because guns and ammunition are indeed more dangerous than drugs. They can be sold openly in the United States. A gun can kill a person. A bag of drugs cannot kill a person as long as the person is not using it. Americans believe that gun ownership is a civil right, so why can't drugs be owned? This is a puzzle that Americans have not yet solved. In fact, it is also a challenge to the margin of human rights. What is the margin of freedom that can be granted to each person in social life? This is the practical question. It is unrealistic to say that a person can enjoy full rights. Locke, Rousseau, and others discussed issues that they failed to address practically and that people today still fail to address practically. I am afraid that we still need to do some reconceptualization of human beings. Why is drug use a major challenge to the United States? Herein lies the problem. Americans believe in the right of each individual to determine his or her own destiny, a right to personal freedom that cannot be taken away. This right evolved gradually after World War II from the right to vote, the right to racial equality, and the right to equality between men and women in the political sphere, to the later right to sexual freedom, the right to pursue one's own lifestyle, e.g. hippies, etc., etc. All of this was accepted by Americans. Now comes the right to take drugs, and Americans cannot accept it, because accepting it would mean the downfall of the nation or a significant part of the nation. Whether there is a solid philosophical foundation in the American system to support this anti-drug initiative, it is too early to say. The opposite philosophical foundation is there. Americans are now mostly in favor of anti-drug policy. This is a factual and emotional choice, a public opinion. What does the future hold? Sexual freedom. Was it ever considered unethical as well? The challenges posed by drug use are not primarily in the realm of philosophy. Few people are interested in such abstract and esoteric questions. If they have not developed certain conditions, the challenges posed by drug use also include what motivates people to use drugs. The answer for many drug users is that they feel bored, empty, in a trance, and depressed. So, they use drugs for a boost. According to one psychiatrist's analysis, 1/3 of Americans have one or more mental problems. So, what are the causes of this phenomenon? In this way, we have to go into a vast perspective. People live in a certain social environment, an environment that includes family, school, business, culture, education, politics, law, and other aspects. Is this environment producing drug addicts or eliminating them? The number of drug addicts is increasing with each passing day. Anti-drug purging is only a negative means because it is only for the results. But how easy is it to change the causes that produce the results? We are well aware of the harmful effects that drug use can have on a nation. After the mid-19th century, opium was imported into China in large quantities, and the harm it produced can be said to still exist today, and as history will have long-lasting effects. Most Americans who oppose drug use worry about their children. A few worry about the development of society as a whole, and individuals think even further. Farther is the hardest thing to accept. Section 5. Triads. Mafia organizations or criminal groups are powerful and tightly organized in American society. Those who have seen the film The Godfather have an understanding of the mafia organization and the brutal rivalry between groups. Those who have seen Family Honor understand the activities and methods of the mafia. Various other forms of literature often take this as a theme. The mafia organization is a headache. While most of what we see is literature, there are artistically processed renderings. In fact, in real life, the existence of the mafia does become a major problem in this society, constituting a great threat to this affluent society and the greatest challenge to this social system. An article in the November 25th issue of the New York Times about two drug cartels was a chilling read. The two cartels, one named Bloods and one named Crips, are based in California. They have taken advantage of a well-developed highway system to build well-organized violent and drug trafficking organizations across the country. The organization grew from California on the West Coast to Baltimore and Washington on the East Coast, expanding from large cities to smaller ones. The main function of this network was to sell cocaine. These two organizations grew to almost every state and 800 locations. The drug trafficking organizations were carefully run and became a kind of organization with good management. Drug trafficking organizations are not only expanding their forces, but are also well equipped. Drug enforcement agencies are often beaten to death because they are not as well armed as drug trafficking organizations. These organizations are equipped with light and heavy weapons, and when they get into trouble, they put up a big fight. Once these organizations come to a new city, they often do not come quietly but make a big splash, driving expensive and luxurious minivans and wearing bejeweled clothes. These people often do not carry ID cards and do not peddle on the streets. They are ambitious and come to a place mainly to build a sales network and other contracts, as if they were doing a serious business. Two criminals were recently caught in Missouri with 1,100 pounds of cocaine, worth a lot of money. It's impossible to say exactly how many people are in these two organizations. In Los Angeles County, the number is around 700, mostly black. Across the country, the lineup is strong. There are about 2,700 cadres in all. Denver has about 700. Oklahoma City has about 60, plus the 30 or so that have been captured. Kansas City also has quite a few. There are large numbers wherever they operate. They are well organized and unscrupulous. They sell drugs in the streets and alleys and intimidate people from reporting to the police. In Omaha, there is a residential area known as Vietnam because of the frequent shootouts and bloodshed. Another recently published book is titled Mafia Enforcer, a true story of life and death in the mob. The authors are Thomas Lerner and Cecil Kirby. The former is a well-known journalist who specializes in writing about the inside of criminal activities and is well known in the U.S. He has won various awards and is an expert on organized crime. The latter is a repentant crime syndicate member. The crime syndicate offered a huge reward of $100,000 for his head. He is heavily protected by the police department under an alias and anonymous. The book, dictated by Cecil Kirby and recorded and written by Thomas Lerner, exposes the inside of the underworld in a thrilling way. Let's just look at the organizational chart of the criminal groups they outline at the top of the book. One type of crime group is the family type, such as the mafia. At the top is the council. Below it is the boss. Below the boss is the small boss. Below the small boss is the head. Below the head are the soldiers, whose duty is to enforce discipline by means of threats, attacks, and assassinations, while carrying out the orders of the leadership. Criminal groups simultaneously form a vast network with various types of people and organizations. The mafia generally engages in two types of activity. One is legal, such as banks, bars, clubs, food production, unions, insurance, real estate, restaurants, entertainment, and everything else. The other is illegal, such as alcohol, assault, explosions, bribery, export, kidnapping, assassination, prostitution, theft, etc. Another type of organization is the non-family type called the motorcycle gang, which has a national leadership, president, vice president, treasurer, etc. Under them are sergeant-at-arms, warlord, road captain, who are responsible for the control of the members and the control of non-members by means of beatings, assassinations, etc. They had a wide range of contacts with all three social groups. There are also two types of activities. Legal activities include car trading, bars, entertainment clubs, food, motorcycle trading, real estate, restaurants, freight, construction, antiques, etc. Illegal activities are the same as those of the mafia. Such organizations are well organized, incredibly energetic, and dominate a large portion of American society. The White House governs American society, and the mob organizations also govern a large part of American society. But this part is dark. We can look at a scene depicted in this book, Chapter 5, The Girl Who Sells Her Body. They often beat some women to death to protect themselves because they thought they might turn out to be informers, and that was one reason why many girls disappeared. Those who disappeared were either tortured or murdered. They were mutilated, crucified, or thrown into the wasteland, where wild animals ate the bodies without leaving a trace. The girls also disappeared for other reasons. Sometimes they worked as prostitutes or escort dancers in low-class bars, becoming too old and useless at the age of 16 or 18. Some because they wanted to get rid of the clubs that owned them, some because they didn't turn in the money they were required to turn in, and some simply because they didn't earn enough money. Reading a chapter like this, one wonders, is this America? Yes, this is America. This is the other side of the coin. The government recognizes that these criminal groups threaten society. In 1985, FBI statistics showed that the four largest criminal groups had 3,800 members, not including 800 smaller groups. Today, the power of criminal organizations and the mafia has grown so much that it has become one of society's biggest headaches. The existence of criminal organizations constitutes a major challenge to the system. The emergence of organized crime is itself indicative of an institutional vulnerability. Naturally, it cannot be said that any one system can completely avoid crime, but the development of criminal groups to a large national organization is really something to think about. There are loopholes in the system in this regard. To be clear, The hole I am talking about here refers only to the space through which something can pass, and there is no specific setting in this respect. For one thing, the American concept is that guilt is punished and innocence is not cared for. The law is put there, and only when the law is broken is it pursued. Perhaps this is an important principle of the political system. No one's behavior can be criminalized and prohibited at the outset to wait and see what happens. However, activities such as organized crime can no longer be controlled and criminalized when they become too numerous. The situation in the United States is a case in point. Second, the American concept is that it is a right for anyone to organize themselves. This is also a basic principle of the political system. The activities of political parties in the United States make the result of the operation this principle. However, if association is allowed, then anyone can associate. Society can only punish individuals who commit crimes and is powerless to deal with these organizations. These organizations often have both legal and illegal aspects, making it difficult for those who want to outlaw them to achieve their goals for a number of reasons. These two issues are potential problems for the U.S. political system. The criminal organizations put them in plain view. Any society that designs its institutions runs into these kinds of problems, where what it wants to prohibit cannot be prohibited because of decisions it wants to allow, and what it does not want to give can only be given because of decisions it wants to give. If there was, is, or will be a problem with the American system, it is here. The American political system is a very successful one in terms of giving and allowing, but it is not a commendable one in terms of prohibiting and preventing. Americans try to stop a lot of things, but it often backfires, and the more things they try to prohibit, the more they end up with. Section 6. Beggar's Kingdom. Victor Hugo's monumental Notre Dame de Paris depicts the suffering and life of beggars in Paris, France, at a time when the images of Quasimodo and Esmeralda were unforgettable. The film, based on Hugo's Notre Dame de Paris, shows the vivid image of Quasimodo. This image is so vivid that people see him as a typical image of the lower class. Strangely enough, when walking in the United States today, which is the first country of the 20th century with the greatest wealth, one always feels that there are many people who resemble this image. They are dirty, filthy, poorly dressed, dull-eyed, slow-moving, and with a pathetic look on their faces that they cannot forget. Such a number of people constitute the 20th century in the United States of the 80s beggar kingdom, also constitute a major social problem in the United States. The official newspaper term for these people is homeless, which means people who do not have a place to live. As the number of homeless people grows, the issue is becoming more and more important to both the government and newspapers. Government spokespersons often talk about it. As you walk around cities large and small, you can see large numbers of homeless people. They are either sitting on the side of the street dumbfounded asking for money, curled up in some corner or doorway to sleep, or walking slowly with a large pile of rags on their backs. Here are a few examples of this problem that I have seen with my own eyes. Washington, D.C., August 1988. A British political scientist invited me to dinner at a Lebanese restaurant. We agreed to walk from the Washington Hilton, where we were staying, to the restaurant and to see Washington at night. We left the Hilton at 7 p.m. and walked down one of the busiest streets downtown. A black man stopped us and asked if we had any change. This was my first time encountering the homeless, and on the way to and from dinner that night, we encountered no less than 10 homeless people asking for money. The probability is very high. New York, December 1988. New York probably has a higher concentration of such people. That night a friend drove to New York with me and was going to stay at a friend's house. Not being familiar with the streets of New York, the car drove into Harlem. This is one of the highest crime areas in New York. It was already midnight. Just seeing groups of people at every street corner, some loud, some drinking, a panic-inducing atmosphere surrounded us. After asking a friend about it the next day, knowing that we passed through Harlem the night before, I could not help but break out in a cold sweat. December 1988, New York. When I went to a friend's house and walked to the door of the building where he lived, I saw a man sitting on the steps eating. He was disheveled and had a pile of tattered luggage next to him. I couldn't help but be alert and hesitant to go in. It turned out that the person looked up first and turned out to be an old woman. She said, "Don't hurt me, I'm homeless. I'm just sitting here to eat. I won't do anything else." Hearing her words, a great compassion flooded my heart. Berkeley, January 1988. I was a visiting scholar at the East Asian Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, and I had to walk through a shopping street every day at lunchtime. There were a lot of people asking for money on this street. In a doorway on one side of the street, for several days in a row, we saw old newspapers and cardboard on the floor, along with a mess of shredded paper, where someone was sleeping every night covered in rags. Although we did not see the man, we can imagine what kind of image he had. There are many such stories, and I'm afraid any person in the U.S. would have experienced them. As winter approaches, there is a particular concentration of homeless people in cities on the West Coast. In front of San Francisco's City Hall, there are hordes of homeless people. In the streets of Seattle, homeless people gather in stations and public places. New York's train station toilets were filled with groups of homeless people demanding money, scaring the average person from using the outhouse. The Greyhound station was no less impressive. On January 20th, 1989, the day Bush was sworn in as the 41st president. During his impassioned speech, television intercut a scene of a homeless man covered in a pile of refuse, sleeping on the ground. This shows how serious the problem has become. The January 16th, 1989 issue of the New York Times had a front-page article discussing the social problems posed by homelessness. The story is about a small village called Elmsford that has become the capital of homelessness in Westchester County. The village has a total of 3,300 permanent residents, but 378 homeless people. They live in 4 motels there. New York state law says that anyone who needs emergency shelter should be provided with it. So, the county's welfare department arranged these things. Of the 378 people, only 9 were from the village, and most were from other places, such as Boston, Louisiana, and Oregon. Westchester County spent $54 million to house them in 1988 and plans to spend $64 million this year. The concentration of homeless people in this area has caused anxiety among the locals, a decline in the quality of life, an increase in crime, an increase in fighting, and a fear that their former peace will be shattered. Many people are ready to leave for other places. Here we can see the kind of social problems and conflicts that homelessness can bring. Elmsford is only a very small community, but is experiencing trouble from such a large number of homeless people. What about the entire United States combined? Why are there homeless people? This is a question that cannot be answered simply. Some people think that it is because they want to, and many homeless people look young and strong and they prefer to beg rather than get a job. Many people do not show sympathy for such people. Others believe that the release of some mentally ill people who were not aggressive not long ago is the main reason why the ranks of the homeless have grown. They are mentally ill and are not likely to engage in work, and their families or relatives are not willing to take care of them. So many of them fall into homelessness. Seriously, don't be surprised to see dysfunctional people on the street in the U.S. because there are too many. There are also people who analyze it in terms of the Vietnam War and believe that many of the homeless are Vietnam veterans who took drugs to support their will in the Vietnam War and as a result could not pull themselves together and destroyed their physical and mental health and could not work like normal people and had to go down this road, and so on and so forth. This phenomenon is quite perplexing. It is a challenge to the American system and the American spirit. On the one hand, there is a great abundance of goods, and on the other hand, there are a great number of people who are destitute. In terms of wealth itself, the United States is not like some developing countries. Those countries have scarce resources that cannot be distributed in such a way as to meet the basic needs of all. The problem with distributing the wealth of society in a way that would be sufficient to provide a decent life for all homeless people is that such a distribution is difficult to develop under this system and is not consistent with the nature of the system. One might argue that homelessness has nothing to do with the system. Well, American culture and the American spirit do not provide the conditions to solve this problem either. A number of government and private institutions are indeed working to address the problem, but how easy is it to talk about? The homeless themselves, for whatever reason, may be their own or society's, but the existence of this phenomenon is a challenge to society. The U.S. is not considered a poor, backward country because of these problems. It is still considered a number one developed country. However, the United States is better known for having these phenomenon. No society is perfect, and no political and administration can be perfect in every way. A good political and administrative system is not one that is designed to be seamless from the start, but one that is able to develop and grow in response to the problems that keep popping up naturally. The key lies in its ability to do so, and that ability must be consistent with the internal logic of how their systems work. Section 7. Black Challenge. The Black Challenge or Black Storm is referring to the black issue. The social and political problems caused by blacks have become a headache and a serious challenge to society. Some people have compared the black issue to the biggest social problem, saying that it will eventually become a fatal problem. In the United States, it can be deeply felt that there is some truth in this statement. The Martin Luther King Center is located in the city of Atlanta. I went to visit the center. Compared to the Carter Center, the Martin Luther King Center is small and dilapidated, partly because it was built earlier. Martin Luther King Jr. was a prominent black civil rights leader. Up until the 1960s, black issues and racial discrimination were still very much a problem. There were schools that only whites could go to, cars that only whites could ride in, hotels that only white people could stay in, and areas that only whites could live in, and blacks had no status and no money. During that era, there was massive unrest and violence to break this segregation, and the federal government had to deploy the military to protect black students from going to white schools. Despite court rulings that segregation was unconstitutional, racial discrimination persisted in real life. It has been more than 20 years since then, and although the living conditions of blacks has improved, the problem of blacks has become more and more serious. A Chinese student at Emory University told me, in the South, even though blacks have been emancipated since the Civil War, the status of blacks is still very low. The cause of the Civil War was whether to abolish or preserve slavery. What we know as Uncle Tom's Cabin depicts the status of blacks at that time. One of President Lincoln's major achievements was to accomplish this goal, the emancipation of black slaves. More than 100 years later, blacks were no longer slaves, but blacks still did not have the social status that whites enjoyed. He said that there is one county near the city of Atlanta where racial discrimination is particularly severe. To this day, this county is against black people living there. It is said that there are no black people there. Any black person who lives there is ostracized. Anti-racist groups have repeatedly supported black people who have the guts to live there and have been beaten out. Last year, an anti-racist group organized a march in that county to protest this attitude and got beaten up by people from that county. It was later reported in the press and caused a national outrage, with people from all over the country showing solidarity with the group and coming to the march, making the police department very nervous. When the people of the county saw that there were many people opposing them, they did not dare to take action because of the anger of the people. However, the people who opposed racial discrimination could only march a little bit and did not achieve any lasting results. To this day, the county still discriminates against blacks. Today, in most places, there are no longer clearly defined policies that discriminate against blacks, and there are even provisions to the contrary. Government agencies, etc., must hire blacks. Some whites feel that this is upside-down discrimination because sometimes whites are more capable of filling a position than blacks, but because of the requirement to hire blacks, whites are put in an unfair, competitive position. However, this is only a superficial phenomenon. In the hearts of many white people, the psychology of hating black people is very strong. For example, in some white residential areas, if blacks live there, many whites will move out. With blacks living there, housing prices would fall, because whites would not want to come and live there. This fact causes blacks and whites to live in largely separate neighborhoods, Every major city has a black neighborhood, which is generally a backward and dirty area. Some blacks get millions of dollars and still can't be in the upper class of whites. The American superficiality is beautiful, and there is no racial discrimination on the surface, but in fact it is deep-rooted. The social status of the black people is lower, and the cultural level is also lower, and the economic situation is even worse. People in the street will meet a lot of poor people asking for money. Most of them are black. Washington, such a surprisingly large number of people in the prosperous city, is too incongruous. In the street square, we'll see many people selling art. Most of them are black. Can also see the recruitment office and the relief office queue of people. Most of them are black. Wandering the streets. Homeless people. Most of them are black. Dressed in rags, unkempt people. Most of them are also black people. Of course, there are also white people who are in such a state of disarray, but the number is smaller. When sightseers see such conditions, they are naturally wary. Black neighborhoods are most typical of the plight of black people. I have been to black neighborhoods in San Francisco, New York, New Haven, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Atlanta, and the impression is extremely bad. Generally speaking, they are more dirty and poor than the areas where white people live, and it is obvious that they are poor areas. In front of many households, there are some lazy black people sitting. Young people stand in groups on the street. People's hearts beat. New York's black neighborhoods are especially bad, and the crime rate in them is extremely high. A friend told me that once an American took him to visit a black neighborhood in New York, and halfway through a police car was shortly in hot pursuit behind them. They thought they had violated a traffic rule. When they stopped, the cop asked if they knew what was ahead of them, and they said yes. The police officer said to be more careful. They both dared to drive quickly through the black area and did not dare to come down. He said if the car broke down, there was no telling what was going to happen. The black population is living in extremely poor conditions, and after desperate times, most of them take the path of crime. The crime situation of the whole society can be ranked among the top in the world, and blacks are especially strong. I heard a lot of stories about black people robbing Chinese people. A friend said that once he accompanied a colleague to a restaurant and met two black people on the stairs with knives demanding money. A Chinese student told me that crime is rampant on 42nd Street in New York, and the Chinese consulate in New York is just down the street. The criminals specialize in robbing Chinese people of their money. The NYPD had to put mounted police in front of the consulate, and the general police were no longer enough, though I did not see any mounted police in front of the Chinese consulate general in New York. This was in broad daylight. There is a plethora of outstanding figures among blacks who have also become icons of social admiration: athletes, singers, basketball players, softball players, boxers, and football players, but the overall status of blacks has not changed. The problems of the black population have constituted a cycle, a loop, that is difficult to untangle. Blacks, as a whole, are less literate, economically inferior, have no control over childbirth, and the welfare system provides for children to receive government assistance. Blacks have a higher fertility rate than whites. Black children do not have access to a good living environment or a good education. Because the previous generation was not well educated and did not receive some basic values, children were not naturally educated and nurtured. Growing up in the environment of black neighborhoods, they are subconsciously and psychologically unbalanced. Generations of blacks grow up without good skills and education, and thus are unable to work in technically demanding positions. Many children have no parents or only one parent, often only their mother. Many children are born to child mothers, i.e., they become pregnant and have children at the age of 14 or 15. How can such children get a good education? This situation is not uncommon in the black community. When they grow up, they can only work in lower-level jobs and do not receive higher financial remuneration. A few struggled to get out of this predicament, but then struggled to be accepted by the white society. This passes from generation to generation, making the snowball of black problems grow bigger and bigger. The black challenge is threatening society and the system. So far, this system has been weak or powerless to deal with this problem. As a result of the system's inaction, a wave of anti-blackness is emerging, in the sense of what neoconservatives call inverted discrimination. Apartheid is history, but the black challenge is growing. The days of the KKK are behind us, but we cannot say that they are gone. If society fails to find fundamental ways to improve the situation of blacks, it is likely to end up with more violent anti-black actions. It is a human weakness that when a problem cannot be solved, the most convenient option is to strongly oppose it. Almost every society has a similar problem where some people are considered inferior, but there may be different reasons for this problem, some from cultural differences, some from historical origins, some from customs, and some from the system. For the United States, the main reason is the system. So, the black problem is a challenge to this social system. Section 8. Indigenous Situation. One of the major reasons the United States was a colony was that the land was already inhabited and owned by Europeans when they came across the ocean to the New World. These were the Indians. The earliest natives date back 10,000 years. In 1925, a black cowboy named George Majunkin found a pile of half-burned beast bones in the New Mexico area. According to scientists' later analysis, these beasts were killed by hunters 10,000 years ago. Before this, it was generally believed that the indigenous history was only a few thousand years. So, who were these people? Where did they come from? Since 1925, scientists have proven that indigenous people have lived on the American continent for at least 20,000 years. However, there are conflicting accounts of how they reached the American continent. One way is that during the Ice Age there was no seawater in the Bering Strait, and people could cross the strait by land. The earliest natives may have come from Asia. The Indians look very similar to the Mongolians in terms of their appearance. There is some truth in this statement, however, some scientists are not convinced. Indian scholars in particular argue that such a theory denies the Indians' original ownership of American lands, since they also migrated from other lands. Where the Indians actually came from is a mystery, I'm afraid. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas created a clash of two cultures. The Europeans disdained Indian culture and denounced it as inferior. The book, America, Peoples and Values, contrasts the differences between these two cultures. The Indian culture includes elements of general culture. 1. Ways of providing food, clothing, and shelter. 2. Religious practices. 3. Artistic creations. 4. Group organization, and 5. Means of transmitting culture. In Indian culture, these components have their own variety of special cultural phenomena, but Indians do not have civilization, which is only available in Europe. Civilization includes 1. Advanced technology, such as the use of metals. 2. Highly developed organization of life, such as cities. 3. Intellectual achievements, such as calendars, writing, etc. 4. Division of labor. These latter the Indians did not have. From a European cultural perspective, contempt for the Indians was natural. It was only after the 1960s that people began to learn to respect different cultures. Naturally, respecting a different culture is not the same as looking down on it. Americans today have this attitude toward many cultures. They are outwardly polite and respectful of a set of different cultures, but in reality they despise it, including, one might say, Japanese culture. In fact, the Indians of the Americas have amazing cultural achievements, such as the Mayan culture, Aztec culture, Inca culture, and so on. But what is the reason why these cultures did not develop into modern civilization is, I'm afraid, an unsolved mystery. In 1492, when Columbus arrived in the Americas, he mistook the Caribbean islands for India and called the people of those places Indians. Later, he found out that it was a big mistake, so he made a mistake and called them Indians. If he had mistaken England for India, he would have changed his mind. When Europeans came to the American continent, they clashed with the Indians. It is said that Europeans brought various diseases to the American continent. The Europeans developed sets of medicines to deal with various diseases, while the Indians did not. At that time, the mortality rate in the villages was around 80 to 90%. Limerick said that in 1831, the famous French scholar Alexis de Tocqueville wrote, "Heaven did not make them civilized, they were doomed to die." White Americans today do not hold such a blatant notion as they did in the past, but another notion exists. God did not make them rich, they are doomed to poverty. Yes, a very strong notion. For the first time, there was a good relationship between Europeans and Indians, but those were the Europeans who first came to do business, not the settlers. Just like the Europeans who initially did business with the Chinese. Initially, the Europeans provided horses and guns to some of the Indians to support their expansion into the interior. Indian social organization and power relations were reorganized. Initially, the Indians also welcomed the Europeans in a friendly manner. At that time, the Europeans needed the Indians for things like food. The Indians did not need the Europeans. However, one of the important reasons the Indians later had to rely on Europeans for was trade. Trade gradually made the self-sufficient tribes dependent on the outside world. Dependence on products made by Europeans, such as wine and the like, the Indians could not help but work for European goods in order to get them. They were tied to debt. Thomas Jefferson said, "We catch a wolf by the ear and can neither control it nor let it go without danger." This was spoken in 1820, and the wolf was the Indian. Today, I'm afraid that feeling no longer exists. For a long time afterwards, European settlers began to dispossess the Indians of their land in large numbers, driving and killing them. A long and bloody war between the whites and the Indians began. There are numerous films and documents in the United States today that depict these scenes, until finally reservations were established to keep the Indians within certain boundaries, just like people did with some animals. Nature reserves were established. White attitudes toward Indians have historically been stranger and different from their treatment of blacks. After the Civil War, a constitutional amendment affirmed the rights of blacks. Before blacks were emancipated, blacks were counted in the House of Representatives as only 3/5 of the population. The amendment affirmed the same rights for blacks but did not include Indians. For a long time, Indians could not testify in court, own property, vote, or leave the reservation. Whites treated Indians and blacks differently. With blacks, whites long denied them access to the fruits of civilization, and schools, churches, stores, restaurants, and public places were closed to blacks. With Indian children, on the other hand, it was different. They were required by law to accept the white system, and Indian children were forced to be sent to school. There were churches on the reservations. The whites wanted the Indians to accept the white system and way of life, very much like the domestication of wild animals. This difference in the treatment of Indians and blacks by the whites was that the Indians were native and the owners of the land, while the blacks were outsiders. Although there was little difference between the two in terms of social status, the Indians were the real Americans, and the problem for the Europeans was how to make the real Americans identify with their country. To this day, Indian issues remain a problem for society. There are now about 500,000 Indians in the United States. Their situation is mostly not comparable to the average. Alcoholism is high due to disappointment and pessimism. The suicide rate among young Indians is 10% higher than the average. 50% of the population is unemployed, and 80% is dependent on government assistance. The Indians still cannot be said to identify with the Anglo-Saxon culture or the dominant culture. They have their own culture and their own language. Indians are generally not well educated and have difficulty competing for jobs off the reservation. A few Indians came to the cities, but they would return to their places of residence and psychologically identify with their own culture. Indians were not as numerous as blacks, so they were not as much of a practical challenge to society. They are, however, a challenge to American civilization, i.e., why European settlers failed to assimilate Indians for such a long time. I don't think it's a technical problem here, but a psychological one. As in a number of places where the American culture is fully displayed, its anti-American sentiment is much stronger. Section 9. Spiritual Crisis. Is there a spiritual crisis in American society? Some people do not think about these questions. The high level of economic development has made it impossible for people to explore the developments behind the surface. It is naturally difficult for people outside of American society to explore what lies behind the glitz and glamour, and it is hard enough to deal with the dizzying array of sights and sounds presented to us. This is especially true when a society is highly developed economically. However, people who live in our land and our people are often more willing to think about this issue. Those who are willing to think about this issue are often people who have reached a certain age or have certain thoughts. What kind of spiritual state exists after the highly developed materialistic scenery of society? Many thinkers, known as conservatives, believe that there is a spiritual crisis. A recent and controversial book is The Closing of the American Mind: How Higher Education Has Failed Democracy and Impoverished the Souls of Today's Students. Alan Bloom, a member of the John M. Olin Center for the Investigation of the Theory and Practice of Democracy at the University of Chicago and a professor at the Council on Social Thought, has translated Plato's The Ideal State and Rousseau's Emile. The publication of this book was hotly debated and strongly resonated. Many saw it as a banner for conservatism, with particularly strong reactions from the black movement and feminists, because the ideas Bloom espoused were in many ways contrary to the black human rights movement and the feminist movement. But there were also many who cried out in favor of it, and Reagan is said to have thought it was a good book, and I asked several professors at the university who also thought it was a good book. What is Bloom's main argument? Bloom's main idea is that today's university education no longer enables its subjects to grasp the traditional values that founded Western society. The development of the university in modern times is increasingly moving towards a kind of cultural relativism and spiritual openness. Cultural relativism requires spiritual openness, but implicit in this cultural relativism is the logic that there are no absolute values in the world and that everything is acceptable or unacceptable. This notion becomes a virtue. Bloom believes that every educational system has a moral goal, and that the educational system seeks to achieve this goal and to reflect it in the curriculum. In the 1950s, education in the United States was pursuing this goal. Cultural relativism succeeded in destroying the idea of Western centrism, but at the same time weakened the status of Western culture. Dominated by this spirit, university education resulted in young people with no concept of the past and no view of the future. The universities responsible for conducting higher education do not provide knowledge of the glorious history of Western philosophy and literature. Students are unable to understand the order of nature and man's place in it through this knowledge. Universities do not provide the self-awareness needed for a serious learning process. What is the result? The younger generation knows very little about the classic works of Western history. Bloom said that once in class he asked his students what book had impressed them most, and surprisingly none could name a masterpiece. One person said the Bible, but this book is not taught in college. Students sometimes go to see movies, such as Gandhi and Thomas More, but these movies, in Bloom's opinion, are artificially and artistically manipulated. Students watch Kramer versus Kramer to learn about divorce and sexuality, but few saw Anna Karenina or The Red and the Black as indispensable in their own lives. Feminists are the enemies of the classic writings. Learn why feminists oppose Bloom here. Bloom argues that the struggles against elitism and racism in the 1960s and 1970s had little impact on students' relationships with the book. These activists rarely attacked classical writings, but all literature is gendered, so how could writers of the past, Socrates, Plato, Shakespeare, Rousseau, Tolstoy, Stendhal, have the ideas of today's feminism? With many forces at work, the classical masterpieces have become yesterday's flowers. The young generation is increasingly indifferent to the best of Western music, and even if they go to listen to this music, they lack the necessary inspiration and passion. Although the 20th century can be described as the century of music and the young generation is incomparably fascinated by music, they are fascinated by rock and modern music, and classical music has died among the younger generation. Beethoven, Chopin, Brahms, Mozart, Wagner, etc. have increasingly fallen into disfavor. Western education has traditionally focused on the place of music in education, believing that music can cultivate the temperament as Socrates and Plato discussed. What will it mean now that education has lost its musical side? The young generation has also lost the basic qualities needed to live as a complete human being in society. They are processed in the modern society with new qualities that are compatible with the new social pattern and at the same time imply a certain crisis. The young generation became self-centered, students who could not be called bad, but neither could they be called noble and sublime. The overheated development of individualism inevitably leads to the decline of the family and the growth of individual centrism. The work that still interests students is Camus' The Stranger, and it is needless to say what this implies. The sexual revolution and feminism posed endless challenges to human creativity. Sexual liberation was a rebellion against the Puritan tradition, but the immediate consequence of sexual liberation was the understanding of happiness as carnal relaxation and the recognition that carnal desire was not something dangerous. These two movements severely impacted the traditional Western values. At the same time, the young generation became separatiners, where everyone is separated from each other. Bloom called them social solitaries. The most visible symbol of this separateness is divorce. The high divorce rate indicates that more and more Americans do not want to live together. Love has become very foreign to students. They have had sex since childhood and developed sexual relationships so easily that the emotion of love has become so indifferent that this valuable emotion is missing from human relationships. Bloom cites numerous facts to illustrate what he calls the end of the American spirit. He himself was an advocate of promoting the cultural traditions and civilization of the West. He celebrates the cultural and spiritual creations of Plato, Socrates, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Shakespeare, Bacon, and others, and advocates the use of these legacies to extend the spirit of Western civilization and culture. He discusses such fundamental ideas as the state of nature and the state of society, the self, creativity, culture, and values. Most of the arguments and theses come from the classic writers of Western history. Bloom has a special affinity for French culture, perhaps because of his translation of the book Emile. His approval and familiarity with French culture can be seen at times in the book. Bloom calls this general trend of development nihilism. Nihilism has become the American way, which is a fatal shock to cultural development and the American spirit, and as a result of this development, the American value system is declining and the entire democratic system is taking a huge hit. Bloom agrees with Tocqueville's notion that Tocqueville had considered the university to have an important place in American democratic politics. According to Tocqueville, the greatest danger of democracy lies in the enslavement of public opinion, and the requirement of democracy is that each person can self-determine his or her own attitude. Democracy frees man from traditional political coercion, religion, and other dogmas. Man is free, but man has to be able to judge himself, and the decline of the traditional value system of the West will eventually hit democracy. There is no value system in society that can be used as a value system to guide individual decisions, and university education does not provide such a system. There is a very close relationship between ideas and social development, and when ideas end, so do the social institutions and ways of behaving guided by such ideas. Bloom's view naturally belongs to the conservative view, which is not enough in the view of some advocates of progress, because society always has to progress and the old things always have to be eliminated. What is noteworthy is the question he raises. It is a fact that the American spirit is facing serious challenges, and it is also a fact that the younger generation is ignorant of traditional Western values, and to what extent will this change in the spiritual sphere affect the development and management of society? The existence and functioning of any social system can never be validated by the letter of the law alone. It is first and foremost a matter of people believing in these fundamental values and being guided by them in the way they behave. If the value system collapses, how can the social system be sustained? In many societies, the problem often lies not in the institutions, but in the decline of the value system. A society without a core value system encounters the greatest political coordination and management difficulties. Here, people often encounter a dilemma. On the one hand, social progress requires a new value system, breaking the shackles of the old one. On the other hand, social harmony and institutional stability require maintaining the core part of a society's value system. Otherwise, a society's value system will come to an end, and it is inevitable that the whole society will fall into chaos and moral crisis. This leads to another dilemma. If society is left to develop naturally, traditional values will be difficult to preserve. And the trend of social development will always be to constantly eliminate the past. The new generation will inevitably have no concept of the past, and without education there will be no continuity. If it is democratic and people choose, the new generation can hardly say how they feel about the past, and the result of the choice is often self-explanatory. Who then will perform this social function? Everyone who thinks about social stability and development, I am afraid, must first think about this issue. Section 10. Empire of the Sun. There is a recent movie called Empire of the Sun that depicts the relationship between the Japanese invasion forces and a group of Westerners in Shanghai during World War II. The Westerners were imprisoned in concentration camps during World War II, guarded by a squad of Japanese soldiers, tortured, starved, and humiliated in their human dignity. The American director made such a film at a time when the Japanese economy was making triumphant inroads into American soil and world markets. It is difficult to guess the director's intention, but the film at least warns that the Japanese have different values from the West, that the Japanese are fierce and cruel, and that the Japanese do not recognize the basic values and beliefs of human beings. Whether this means that the Japanese and the West are winning on another battlefield, the economic field, is something that people need to think about for themselves. Japan's economic success has been hailed as a miracle. The Japanese themselves were proud of it. In World War II, Japan was defeated and its territory was occupied. However, looking at the development of human history, Japan leaped up to become the world's leading economic power in a fairly short period of time. Naturally, we cannot talk about political and military powers at the moment. Some Japanese aspire to this, and while it is not possible to talk about it yet, it is not impossible in the future. To sum up the experience of human social development, the power of a strong country is, first, in military power, second, in economic power, and third, in political art. The Japanese do not lack the latter two, but the former is bound by the Constitution, though the Constitution is only a piece of paper which is also made by people. What one generation believes in, the next generation is not sure to believe. As soon as the feng shui turns, the situation will be very different. The Empire of the Sun was forcing America's hand. The strength of the Japanese economy impressed the Americans, and before World War II came to an end, Benedict, the famous cultural anthropologist, wrote a sensational book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. The book contains a fine analysis and insight into Japanese culture, but not without the flavor of a superior people looking at an inferior people. It was like a zoologist describing the habits of gorillas or golden monkeys, detailed and accurate but in no way envious. A few decades later, another American wrote a book called Japan as Number One. The author is Harvard professor Ezra Vogel. This book is not in any way a zoologist's experience, and it is full of praise and envy. This shift is quite dramatic. On November 28, 1988, an unnamed Japanese man bought a Picasso painting from 1905 at a London auction house and paid more than $38 million, setting a record price for a work of 20th century art, the third highest price in the world for a painting. This shows the strength of the Japanese. Japan's economic invasion of the United States far exceeded the indiscriminate bombing of that one day in Pearl Harbor. In the streets of the United States, there are Japanese cars, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, and so on. In the electrical stores, it is even more Japanese, a wide range of Japanese electrical products, all kinds of things. The Japanese are buying property in the United States. San Francisco is full of Japanese people, and Honolulu is said to have become the world of Japanese people. Japanese people buy houses and pay cash. Due to the arrival of the Japanese, housing prices have risen sharply, and Americans who do not have money can only look forward to housing. The tall buildings of IBM in Atlanta were taken into Japanese ownership. I visited one of the best gardens in the country in St. Louis, and ended up seeing a large portion of the Japanese garden. The Sears Tower in Chicago, the world's tallest building, was recently up for sale, and there was concern that it would go to the Japanese. A friend told me that some Japanese people buy houses without ever asking for a price first, wandering around the city, and when they see a house they like, they just click and let someone get it. Japanese investment in the United States has increased greatly. Many Japanese products are produced on American soil. The shadow of the Empire of the Sun is looming over the United States. Let's look at some serious numbers. Japan's population, 1985, was 120 million, compared to 289 million for the United States. Japan's landmass is over 377,000 square kilometers, compared to 9,372,000 square kilometers for the U.S. Japan is a fraction of the U.S. GNP, gross national product, in 1987, was $2,385 million for Japan, and $4,488,000,000 for the U.S. The total value of trade was $379 billion for Japan and $677 billion for the United States. In terms of the ratio of land area to population, the difference between GNP and total trade value is not significant. Japan's trade, 1987, accounts for 36.5% of total exports and only 21% of imports to the U.S., while the U.S., 1986, accounts for only 11.9% of total exports and 22.4% of imports to Japan. Investment is also high, and Japan now has factories in many U.S. states. In terms of GNP per capita, Japan has surpassed the U.S., with the 1985 figure being $16,709 for the U.S. and $17,244 for Japan. From 1981 to 1985, the U.S. GNP growth rate was 2.4% compared to 4.1% for Japan. The trade gap between the U.S. and Japan grew larger and larger. During World War II, Americans knew Japan because of the war. Today, Americans know Japan for its pleasures. The intrusion of the Japanese economy is demonstrated by its occupation of most American households. The power of the solar empire has grown like nuclear fusion. In 1985, $1 was worth 240 yen. Today, it is worth 130 yen. Susan Chira, writing in the New York Times, 1988, November 28th, said, quote, "Japanese companies can easily outperform their competitors and purchase American property or companies." End quote. Japanese investors have lent huge amounts of money to the United States, mostly buying treasury securities, and they can shake up the market. Japan became the ruler of the local economy, and the currencies of other countries and regions did not appreciate as fast as the yen. Japan has significant investments in Taiwan and South Korea, and Japan is able to sway these regions. Japan became a greater world mega-rich country than the U.S. It donated money to developing countries and had new power to influence international economic policy making. The Japanese now have control over the U.S. economy, and many Americans are worried about it. In the first 7 months of 1988, Japan spent $9 billion on foreign companies, several of which were American companies. American markets and companies fell to the Japanese. The challenge to the United States from the Empire of the Sun is serious, although it cannot be said that Japan has replaced the United States, nor can it be said to do so in the near future. Japan's aggressive katana has been pointed directly at the United States. Japan actually grew up under the wing of the United States. Japan benefited from the U.S. occupation, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. The contours of Japan's current system are also a product of the Americans. Today, however, Japan, the defeated nation, is even richer than the victorious United States. The Japanese are also unwilling to conceal this feeling and are happy to roll over and show their affection. In quite a few places, it amounts to doing it to the Americans, who sometimes can only stare in disbelief. Under the principle of free economy, it is impossible to turn the Japanese away. Moreover, the U.S. economy does have unspeakable suffering and cannot help but look up to others, psychologically and emotionally. Americans do not like the Japanese. The question is, why did it end up this way? In addition to various reasons, such as the management system, the difference between the two cultures is an important reason. A certain system is bound to have an effect that does not depend on human will, but a certain culture will have an effect that does not depend on human will. The end of the economic competition between the United States and Japan is the product of the different genes of the two cultures. To a large extent, this is more of a cultural constraint rather than an institutional constraint. Some people say that the United States and Japan, then the Eastern culture, has the upper hand. What factors are at play? It is difficult to list them all here, but I can only give a brief overview. Japanese culture promotes collectivism, while American culture promotes individualism. Modern mass production is about division of labor and cooperation, and the collectivist gene in Japanese culture is more suitable for collaborative production. American individualism tends to reject large-scale or oblivious cooperation, and Americans speak first and foremost of the status of the individual. Americans tend to think about individual success, while the Japanese are often led to think about collective success. The unifying spirit of large Japanese companies is difficult to find in the United States. Japanese people can dedicate their lives to a company and do a small part of the work. Americans, I'm afraid, have difficulty doing this. There are pros and cons to collectivism for the development of a society, but it is clear that collectivism unites more than individualism. Japanese culture focuses on personal devotion, and American culture focuses on personal enjoyment. The American culture is hedonistic. Work is for pleasure. Americans never have trouble with themselves, and money is spent. Americans with large savings are rare animals. Many people often do not know where to get the money tomorrow. Americans borrow money to buy houses, cars, college, etc. Spend it first. Japanese culture does not have a high personal position and does not emphasize personal enjoyment, but rather advocates personal dedication. Japanese men work. Many people have to work until midnight, are working long hours consciously and voluntarily. There is no overtime pay. I was told that if a Japanese man does not work until midnight at night in the company, people will think he has no drive and is not valued. The American standard of living is probably one of the highest in the world, surpassing Japan in housing, transportation, education, food, and environment, although the per capita income is not as high as in Japan. The hedonistic culture leads people to spend large sums of money on welfare rather than investment. The Japanese are typically economic animals with a strong desire to invest, but not as focused on personal enjoyment as the Americans. The Japanese culture is a regulatory culture, and the American culture is a hands-off culture. The Japanese culture creates an atmosphere where everyone accepts strict management, so the whole economic and social mechanism is more tightly organized and the whole machine runs more uniformly. This mechanism, when used for economic development, is bound to unleash tremendous energy. Americans are not likely to accept the Japanese style of management. Americans are more diffuse, more casual, and the operation of the machine is more democratic. The Japanese are forced by their superiors to fight the world and must fight. Americans tend to fight for their own motives, and instructions from the top can be democratically denied, and the top can accept this. There are no such stories in Japan, or not many of them. And so on and so forth. The issue raised here is not only the difference between the two cultures, but also the requirement that one reevaluate the two institutions. The American system, which is generally based on individualism, hedonism, and democracy, is clearly losing out to a system of collectivism, self-forgetfulness, and authoritarianism. Perhaps Americans would rather lose out economically than give up their institutions. This system guarantees the fulfillment of faith and also a certain prosperity for society. Today's world landscape seems to indicate that this system is hardly a guarantee of America's most developed status. People are often faced with the choice of maintaining a value system or pursuing a more effective system, but against the traditional value system, sometimes the question is whether a certain culture can allow a society to choose a whole different system, and often it cannot. On the other hand, it is unlikely that Americans will accept Japanese culture. Americans tend to be less interested in Japanese culture, and many believe that the Japanese are in an underdeveloped cultural climate. In this regard, many Americans look down on the Japanese. This psychological barrier will ensure that the United States does not develop faster than Japan, and also that Americans will have difficulty in finally accepting the empire of the sun. The United States today encounters a challenge from Japan in large part because American institutions, culture, and values oppose the United States itself. After World War II, the United States was blessed with the right time, the right place, and the right people to grow socioeconomically at an astonishing rate. However, 30 or 40 years apart, America's position was severely and forcefully challenged. It can be said that Japan was only the first nation to challenge the United States. In the next century, more nations are bound to challenge the United States as well. It is then that Americans will truly reflect on their politics, economy, and culture. Of course, in the case of Japan and the United States alone, it is impossible for Japan to surpass the United States in terms of resources and territory. The problem is that the existence of all the mutually exclusive factors and forces in American society, if they continue to move in this way, will not only make their advantages unavailable, but will also constitute an unstoppable undercurrent of crisis. End of chapter 11. End of America Against America by Wang Huning.